Hello and welcome to Africa Today. I am Esther Mokwariola. Home to more than 1 billion people with 6 of the fastest growing economies in the world, Africa is largely a mixed bag of the good, the bad and the uncertain, readily making it a place worth talking about. Call it crystal ball watching, agenda setting or common sense hypothesis, but analysts say there is no better time than now to project on how the continent's economy will fare in 2019. And so we ask, what are your expectations on the economy across Africa in 2019? You can join the conversation and share your thoughts with us on Twitter at TVC News NG. Well, we're here to report, and Africa Today will be right back. Welcome on board.
Nigeria and South Africa, the two economies that normally push the continent into faster growth, struggled to reclaim their potential, even though commodity prices improved. Lower oil production in Nigeria offset higher oil prices, and in South Africa, weak household consumption growth was compounded by a contraction in agriculture, according to the World Bank. And although capital inflows to Africa have grown exponentially in recent years, risks exist because much of the increase has come from debts. The IMF reported in 2018 that liability inflows ballooned from $3 billion in 2000 to $60 billion in 2017.
What we're concerned about is really the pace of increase rather than the level of debt on average. But what is worrisome is that in countries, particularly oil exporters, other natural commodity exporters, what we've seen is a pronounced increase in debt in the last couple of years. And there, of course, it reflects the big hit to their economies following the commodity price crash, the hit to revenue levels, the hit to their economies.
Food and fuel prices spiked, and there was outcry from the proverbial man on the street, business communities and civil societies. Analysts and charities urged governments to increase revenue instead by cracking down on graft and by taxing the richest more.
Taxing people more before you address these leakages, which are through corruption, mismanagement, will not help because they are still going to collect all the money and then there'll be another headline. 3 months down the line, billions have disappeared.
Sudan has also had to watch its fortunes disappear. The country's economy has been struggling since the South seceded in 2011, taking with it 3/4 of previous oil output. The crisis deepened in the course of the year as the black market for US dollars effectively replaced the formal banking system after the Sudanese pound was devalued, making it more difficult to import essential supplies. While the Sudanese government fights to prevent economic collapse and civil disorder at the close of the year, the IMF predicts that most other African countries will fare better and could grow by about 3.8% in the year 2019.
Welcome back. In 2018, 44 African countries signed the Continental Free Trade Agreement in Kigali, Rwanda at the 10th extraordinary session of the African Union Summit. Well, analysts believe intra-African trade could be very key in 2019 in ensuring that the continent thrives under a vibrant economy. Now joining me to look at expectations on the economy across Africa in 2019 is Adeniyi Kunnu, researcher and policy analyst. And on Skype, I have Nonso Obikili, policy associate economic research in Southern Africa. Good to have you both on the program tonight.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, let me begin with you, Adeniyi. What's your position first on the level of growth of some African economies in the past year, with particular reference to Nigeria, Zimbabwe, and South Africa?
We were hopeful that we'll do excess of 2%, but we're doing less than that as we speak. But if you consider the budget of some economies in Africa, for instance, South Africa, I'd like to go there, that has a population of 57 million plus. The calendar year called 2018 saw South Africa put a budget at 116 to 118 billion US dollars.
Right.
So if you check the population of the country and the amount that South Africa allotted in terms of what it should give to its people, it is, far, far ahead of what Nigeria, the most populous black nation on earth actually gave. Population in excess of 190 million, but in dollars, the budget for 2018 is about 23 to 26 billion US dollars. So it tells you first that the amount allotted to that cannot measure up. And anytime you're talking about bolstering the economy, the ability of the people to actually engage, you know, in the economic activities will always go a long way in actually making funds circulate to bolster the economy. So that hasn't happened. I'd like to run to Kenya, a country that is equally bedeviled by the challenges that most African nations are bedeviled by. Kenya increased taxation, but Kenya has not given to the people what it should get in terms of widening the opportunities to strengthen the economy, in terms of ensuring that small businesses thrive. That has been criticized. So if you look at Nigeria also, late last year when the president presented the budget, it made the news that there is intention for the presidency or for the current administration to actually increase tax and make lives unbearable. But it has come out to debunk that. And I think the best thing for any economy to actually do now to thrive is to ensure that there are opportunities to make more money so that you can actually get more tax in. And at the same time, corruption is part of the problem. The person who actually said that, you know, echoed my position. Corruption is one of the challenges that has not allowed, you know, major economies of Africa to thrive. And for the West, essentially, that continues to give you these monies. For instance, if you check the calendar year called 2018, again, I should say, more funds came into Africa, but it came in the form of debts. So as we speak, that is a huge challenge. They also talked about the Africa Free Trade Continental Agreement. That could bolster the economy by about 3 trillion. But the challenge is, what are the infrastructure available in certain countries that are willing to engage? There is no economy of the world that wouldn't love to engage with Nigeria, but the challenge is, what are the opportunities for them here? And it is why we must begin to rethink how we have to address these issues. Don't forget, we had a budget of excess of 9 trillion last year. The budget is lesser this year, 8.83 trillion naira. So if you look at the fact that we're going to spend less this year, yet we've got increase in all of the areas where we need to spend money, you begin to ask questions. What really can we do to shore up this thing? So I believe strongly that if at all anything must be done, it must begin with infrastructure, because one of the things that enhances the success of small-scale businesses has to do with the available infrastructure. Nigeria need about 160,000 megawatts of electricity, 160,000 for the records. Nigeria generates about 7,000, is able to get across to the country about 5,000. Eventually, people are able to use 3,000 of that. So that is an area that's very important to address.
Okay, let's leave that for now. Let's quickly get Nonso Obikili's perspective on another issue pertaining to Nigeria's economic growth this time again. Now, the economy, according to the Finance Ministry, witnessed steady growth year on year in 2018 as against the previous year. What's your assessment so far?
Well, I think in general, the growth has been better than 2017, but it's still been very slow. The economy is growing much slower than population growth, which means on average, people are getting poorer. So the growth is positive, yes, but it's nowhere near fast enough. And I think it's the same story across the big African economies. You've seen Nigeria grow at 2%, South Africa should grow at 1%, Egypt's marginally higher, but still struggling to grow. And so that's really a challenge for Africa. There's growth, but it's nowhere near fast enough. And the question is, how do you get it to become fast enough to actually make an impact in people's lives? I think it's, for Nigeria especially, it's a complicated story. We have an economy that's dependent on oil, and for African countries as well, dependent on other commodities. And the commodities markets are very volatile. You can't predict whether the prices will be up or down or high or lower in any given year. And that has created some sense of instability in the sense that the economies don't know exactly what they will look like over the next year because they are reliant on these commodities that have very volatile prices.
And to talk about the challenges the Nigerian economy also faced, let's not forget that it was being rated as a poverty capital in 2018. Now, with this, bearing this in mind, how much of a challenge do you think Nigeria would have in 2019?
I think it's going to be a big challenge. If you keep in context that we have about 23% unemployment rate now, which means we have about the size of Togo and Benin Republic in Nigeria who are unemployed. then you start to get the kind of sense of the scale of improvement that needs to happen. Any growth below 5, 6, 7% will definitely not be enough to actually create jobs and to move the needle on poverty. If you have no jobs, then poverty can't reduce. And so the question is, how do you engineer Nigeria to go from 1, 2% growth that it is now to growing at 6, 7%, which it's not an easy thing to think about.
All right, let's quickly go on a very quick break. Now you're watching Africa Today, and we'll be looking at the expectations on the economy for Africa in 2019. We'll have more in just a moment. Stay with us. Now, Africa is largely seen as a collection of nations who produce items that they don't consume while consuming resources they don't produce. And Africa's economic growth in 2018 was reportedly slower than expected at the time when China renewed its commitment to invest an additional $60 billion in the continent over the next 3 years. Now, Adeniyi, let's look at South Africa's economy, which is said to be the second largest in Africa after Nigeria, which is said the economy shrank by at least 2.2% in the first quarter of 2018. Now, what do you think could have been responsible for this, and how do you think the economy can be better for it in 2019?
Well, I need you to understand that whatever affects any major economy on the African continent also affects the South African economy.
Right.
So I'd like to come to Nigeria. South Africa owns a telecommunications company that has thrived in this country for many years. And I must say that 60% of what that particular telecommunications company generates on the African continent comes from Nigeria. Don't forget that there's something called repatriation of funds. So when monies are made in different countries of the world, what they make goes back. So you want to tell me how well has the company owned by South Africa thrived here, and how well has its business concerns also thrived in other parts of Africa or where there are business concerns? Also the satellite television in this country.
Right.
Now, apart from that, you want to look at change of government and the challenges it took them to move from the man that was there to Cyril Ramaphosa. Do not also forget that they've had issues with corruption scandal. And they also have the Chinese interested in certain things happening in that country. According to what you just mentioned before this discussion started, China has renewed its commitment to invest $60 billion on the African continent. And when anybody brings the money into your economy, to a great extent, he or she who pays the piper begins to dictate the tune. And anytime there's a major move by certain investors to come in, there are always variables because there are influences, particularly on the back end. So you see the stocks get affected. Don't also forget that in 2018, a Nigerian company quoted in the Johannesburg Stock Exchange also got the hit, where for a particular moment it was delisted from actually operating there. All of those things are part of the shockers that can affect the economy of South Africa. So when you put all of that together, it can be said very unequivocally that it has contributed to what has actually shrunk the economy of South Africa. And I have to say again that world powers are beginning to get some new interest. Don't forget that only last year, Theresa May visited South Africa and also came here. We also saw Xi Jinping, who went across. The point remains that anytime you see such big moves, it's a function of what is happening in there. What can we do to salvage the situation, and what is it we can take out? Because the West will never give you anything for free. Absolutely. And even whatever appears very favorably from the side of the Chinese government is not free after all said and done. So that is the picture. Until Africa begins to reason that it needs to do business with Africa, then until African leaders begin to create such opportunities that will allow them re-engineer. For instance, you're talking about Nigeria. When you talk about factors of production, you want to mention land, labor, capital, and entrepreneur. Do we have the capital? I'm in doubt. A company or a country that is dependent on oil may not have all of the resources to do that. So we must think out of the box. Where is the next place where we get the money? Knowledge economy. You're talking about IT. How much are we investing in the new cash cow of the world? Because if you look at creating ICT hubs, could go a long way, ensuring that even from primary school levels, we revamp the education so that kids begin to catch up on all of the things that have left us behind.
Right.
Only then can we, because it has to be long term.
Absolutely. Now, let's quickly get your thoughts now, Nonso Obikili. Let's look at this economy, Africa, which is quite promising. Now, according to the World Bank report, it is quite promising, African economy, to the continent and also to investors. And according to its projections, the regional GDP growth of 3.5% was forecasted in 2019. Now, if this is the case, now what needs to be done to achieve this, and how can we sustain this?
Africa in terms of pockets of places. And on average, yes, Africa goes at 3%, but within Africa, there are places that are expected to do relatively well.
Right.
Places that are expected to grow 6, 7, 8%. And I think those places are the places that would lead the way. Places like Rwanda and Ghana and Ethiopia are places that are seeing relatively strong growth. And I think they will lead the way for African countries. I think as a whole, Africa needs to integrate more and be more productive. So you have large countries like Nigeria and South Africa, where you have large pools of people who don't have the skills to compete in the modern economy. And that's proven to be a big challenge. Across almost all African countries, you have unemployment rates that are 16, 17%. In Nigeria, South Africa, over 20%. And what that means is that there are structural issues in terms of job creation. So even in the countries where you have growth, there's not enough job creation. And in the countries where there's no growth, of course, there's also no job creation. So there's many structural challenges. I think the issues are different for each particular country. For a country like Nigeria, the country needs to migrate from an oil-producing economy to an oil plus something else producing economy. For South Africa, they need to migrate the labor force to be more skilled intensive. And so you have different challenges in different places. But as a whole, Africa needs to get more productive.
And talking about being productive here, you know, some African economies, talking about Nigeria, have talked about moving away from oil, diversifying the economy. Are we doing enough to really sustain our economic growth with our projections for 2019 here, Nonso?
I don't think so. Not for Nigeria, at least. Because the fact still remains. Crude oil still remains about 96% of all our exports. And it's difficult to point to a policy that is geared towards exporting something else. So I don't think that the focus is there yet. I think it needs to be, but as at now, I don't think it's there yet. I think there are a couple of countries that are trying to become more international. Rwanda is trying to become more international. Ghana is trying to become more international. And you can kind of see it clearly, the kind of policy that they enact, where the focus is to make stuff and export it. But the two big economies, Nigeria, South Africa, are still lagging behind in that perspective.
And what do you think could be the major contributor if that is the case? Because if we're the largest economy, definitely we should be taking our steps forward than backwards.
Well, in international markets, you can't bully your way to winning. So we've had a historical industrial policy that has been skewed towards protecting local industry, creating barriers for foreign competitors so that local industry can thrive. And you can do that in your local economy, but you can't do that internationally. You can't force China to ban products from Norway, right? You have to be able to compete. You have to be able to produce at an effective cost and at the same quality as everybody else. And we are still way behind that. We have problems with infrastructure that don't allow us to compete. We have problems with human capital that don't allow us to compete. And so those are the key challenges that we need to get over. How we'll get over them, it's going to be a challenge. But in the long term, we need to realize that if we want to play the game in international markets, we have to be able to compete. And not just competing against our neighbors, but competing against the big economies like China, like the US, like Brazil. I think there was a report that came out 2-3 years ago that even despite the rapid growth in Asia, wages were still relatively lower compared to Nigeria and other African countries, which means it was still cheaper to produce things in places like Vietnam and Thailand than compared to Nigeria or Ghana, which is problematic. If you're trying to grow, then you have to be cost effective, you have to be very productive. If you're not that, then you can't compete.
Your thoughts. Now, let's quickly get Adeniyi Kunnu's perspective on another matter. Now, let's look at the issue of foreign loans now, which we get to talk about, and which you also mentioned earlier on.
That's true.
And that is part of what we see in most African economies, even this day, and up till when we don't know how far how long it will go on. But let's talk about the benefits. How beneficial is this to the African economy, and of course the likely implications?
Well, let's understand that there was a report from the IMF that last week that the world's debt stands at $184 trillion as we speak. And it's sad that for Nigeria, in excess of 30% of our per capita in terms of budget and income actually goes to that. So that tells you that if Nigeria, for instance, earns $100, 60% will be channeled into payments of debt, amongst other things. So you could hear that oil is selling for $2,000 per barrel, for instance. About 1,200 or 1,400 of that amount would definitely be going back into, payments of debt and the rest of it all. So no matter what we want to talk about debt here, of course, the United States happens to be the world's greatest debtor, and about $14 trillion, followed by China, that's about $5-6 trillion. But we can see how these countries deploy funds. Then you want to talk about the budget of the U.S. The U.S., for instance, has a population of excess of 300 million, but the yearly budget is in excess of 500 billion. So that tells you that more money goes into the economy, and there are plans. But okay, let's look at this administration, for instance. I'd just like to start with the Buhari administration. In excess of 6 trillion has so far been collected in terms of loan. I'll talk about the Jonathan administration. In excess of 3 trillion was collected. But if we look at 9 trillion, approximately 10 trillion, and we look at the Nigerian people in terms of provision of infrastructure, it's going to be a hard sell that the money has actually translated to what it should be done with. So that tells you that if you collect loans, for instance, and the loans are granted as easy as it comes, if it is not deployed appropriately, it's going to increase poverty. For instance, you want to build a bridge, and you go to build a bridge at a place where you have only 10 vehicles goes through that place in 1 year.
Very quickly,
it's not commercially viable. So I'm saying that as much as countries can use debt to thrive and, structure out proper repayment plans, I've not seen much of that here. And let me add there that less than 40% of Nigeria's arable land is actually being used for agriculture, whereas Nigeria has 77.7% capacity to actually cultivate its land for agricultural purposes. So
we definitely have a long way to go if we're told to, move this economy forward.
Yes, please.
To be the top first in the world. Yes, thank you very much, Adeniyi Kunnu, for your insights on Africa Today.
Thank you.
And I'd also like to thank my guests on Skype, Nonso, Obikili. It's a pleasure to have you share your thoughts as well on the program.
Thank you.
Well, for a continent so rich yet so poor, a deficiency in effective leadership is said to be largely responsible for the region's slow pace towards sustainable development in recent years. Now, in reaching for greater heights in 2019, solutions would have to be made in Africa, where regional cooperation and economic integration becomes a tool to lift millions out of poverty. And that is our package for today. But don't forget to join the conversation as usual on Twitter at TVC News NG. And if you like, follow me for updates around Africa at Esther TVC News. Until the next one again, I am Esther Mokwariola. And always remember, Africa can only get better.